Hello, my name is Rebecca Cypess, and I'm very pleased to introduce fortepianist and scholar Patricia García Gil, whose program titled CROSS-COMPILATIONS is featured in the 2023 Bloomington Early Music Festival. Patricia, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation about the program that you'll be sharing with the festival. Behind your program, thank you. Behind your program is a tremendous amount of research about the circulation of music through the Iberian Peninsula and in Latin America. And you show that the works by composers like Scarlatti, Soler, Haydn, and others became extremely popular in domestic spaces, in salons, in academies, churches, convents, and public concerts. And through the circulation of this music, it had a tremendous effect on social structures of Iberia and its colonies. To start, could you please set the stage for us? What kinds of music were popular in these institutions, whether on the Iberian Peninsula in the mid to late 18th century or even in Latin America?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you for being here and for your time. And thank you for this question, Rebecca. So I think it's important, before replying to it concretely, to set the stage, but a little bit earlier, in order to understand the progressive change that happened throughout the 18th century. So because this was my focus of this program, actually, to try finding music that was not religious, because until then, I think most of the music that we can find has religious connotations. So also, let's not forget that during the colonial period, the cultural transfer was very asymmetrical and also influenced by power dynamics. So this is why probably Catholic church was very prominent. So this is why they used the music for transferring power and establishing European traditions in that way. And also many of the composers during the 17th and 18th centuries were priests. But then I think, like, with the spread of the Enlightenment principles that started in Europe and then probably arrived to the colonies maybe a little bit later. I'm not an expert in this, but I think definitely, since they were part of those countries in Europe, they also got the influence of the Enlightenment. I think the situation changed progressively, and the religious ambience was not the only one in which music was composed or performed, especially towards the end of the colonial period. So, as I said, the sources that I have explored to create the musical program that I will be that the festival will be showcasing, I think I wanted them to reflect the popularization of domestic music in varied social spheres, which is also very special because, well, the first part of a program takes on music that belonged to or was found or related, let's say better, to Maria Barbara, so a queen, right? But then the other sources are, one of them belonged to perhaps very likely Black slave in Chile. And the other one to a lady of unknown origin, Guadalupe Miner, who probably was part of this new elite that was in the service of the monarchy, probably, but is not noble of origin, right? So I think the fact that they all had access to music and music education and were able to write music and have music for their use means, and also being women, means that there is a change. So, well, in order to, sorry, I just got off the track a little bit, but in order to reply to your question particularly, the documents that we have, that I found from the late 18th century show the music programs were miscellaneous, based off a mixture of maybe 8 or 15 different pieces, and maybe sometimes even movements extracted from larger works and designed to please the ear more than to elevate the spirit, right? So this is also like the kind of program that I have designed. It's like a mix of pieces. I've actually choose to play like complete sonatas because we are talking about keyboard music in this case, but it's also a mix of authors that were alive at the time. So of course now I'm playing past music, but at the time they didn't play, as far as I know, repertoires from past eras.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Really looking forward to hearing more about the sources that you've found. So what kind of evidence have you found that attests to the travel of European music across the ocean?
Right. So, well, first of all, I have to say I've benefited from the fact that I'm able to read in Spanish because I'm Spanish originally. So I have found the work of great musicologists that have specialized in this area. But then I've also been able to find records in newspapers from the time, correspondence between some of these composers with people, that some people were in the Peninsula, and then people who were in the colonies, and then customs as well. For example, that was very interesting for finding out about the entrance of fortepianos for the first time in Latin America. And then there are inventories of musical libraries, especially from this elite that I mentioned before, or the new bourgeoisie. And then also there are records of shops, especially when they start printing music, which is not at the beginning of the century, but towards the late years again. So yeah, but apart from the printed music, which is of course the biggest evidence, right? Because when they started printing music, it was easier to travel from Europe to the colonies. There are these manuscripts, and this was what really drew my attention, that belong to women. So one example that I almost mentioned it before, but I will be more concrete now, is the Libro Sexto de María Antonia Palacios, which dates circa 1790. And this was discovered only in the 1970s by a musicologist named Guillermo Marchant. And this was almost like disregarded in, like among trash in a Chilean institution. But then when he found it, he found compositions handwritten by Haydn, by Pleyel, by Spanish composers, and then also anonymous composers that perhaps were local. But the fact is that some of these compositions, especially some of the ones from Spanish composers, were not found in other manuscript or printed music at all, not even in Spain. So that means that music somehow reached the colonies and, maybe remained there and not in Spain. So it's very important because it was preserved there, even though it was Spanish. And then the other one, it's de Cuaderno de Lecciones y varias piezas para clave o fortepiano para el uso de Doña María Guadalupe Miner. This is the one that I said that is of unknown origin because they still don't know who this lady was. And this one dates 1804, and this is preserved in a library in Mexico City. And it also contains, it's also a proof that of these travels between Iberia, but not only, also Italy, especially, but even Vienna, because it has Haydn. Haydn, I think he was really, really famous in Iberia and in the colonies at the time. So it contains these pieces by Haydn. And also it contains a piece that really also drew my attention because it was written by a woman, Marquesa de Vivanco. It's a menuet for four hands. But Marquesa de Vivanco is, again, another lady of unknown origin. So maybe it's even like the same one as María Antonia Palacios, the owner of this book. So, all these manuscripts and, of course, printed music later, they prove, and this is what I focused on in order to see how was this music arriving from Europe, the whole of Europe, actually. And as I said, especially from Italy, because Italian music was the fashion at the time, I think.
Yeah, this is fantastic. So you're talking about this kind of pan-European network that links Spain and Portugal with Vienna and with Italy. I wonder, is there one additional nexus here, and is that possibly England? So just thinking about where these fortepianos were coming from when they arrived, like I know that the fortepiano building culture in Spain in the 18th century relied heavily on English instruments and English models. And I wonder if those were the kinds of instruments that were being imported to Latin America. Is that correct?
I think that's right. Yes. What I found were records of English pianos and also German. So German could actually mean Viennese, really? If we think about it, because at the time maybe they were really related, or at least Viennese mechanics.
That's very
Yeah, definitely English as well. Yes.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay.
But also at some point, we also find local workshops where they're building fortepiano, especially in Mexico.
Wow. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. I would love to hear more about those.
Yeah.
But can you tell us what contexts for music making do you trace in 18th century Latin America? I know you've mentioned already domestic spaces. What else is, where else is this music being played and heard?
Yeah, exactly. So domestic for sure, because of the way these manuscripts are intended, you know, it's for like private use and practice maybe. And there are more, like these are not the only ones that I've come across, although I have not really delved into the other ones, but there are more. And I'm sure there are more that are not yet discovered for sure. Then, so apart from this, well, we have in the first part of my program, Maria Barbara, the queen, as I said before, the queen of Spain, Portuguese Spanish queen. Well, probably she definitely played the music. She was also a student, so that is the other ambience actually, being a student and practicing. But probably her library was used for concerts in the court. We know for sure there was a lot of music going on, not only in Madrid, but also in El Escorial, which is another royal palace, which is outside Madrid. And there were many salons and court and rooms designated for music making. So, for example, Soler was the music director of that palace in El Escorial. And then also at this time, I think it's when the musical performances advanced towards what we know today as a public concert, although it's still very different, but it's perhaps semi-private, like maybe in Vienna, but instead of being called academias, it's called tertulias, or also academies, actually, academias in Spanish. So we know, for example, the Montero sonatas that I'm playing in the program, they were dedicated to one of these academias known as Real Sociedad Vascongada. It was in the Basque country. So yeah, these were events where professional musicians participated, and sometimes also amateur aristocrats. And they performed especially maybe chamber music, I think, and arrangements for small groups. And then the aristocrats would cover the cost, but when it was organized by the bourgeoisie, it was shared. So they would share the costs. And this is basically the academias, I think, the ones organized by the bourgeoisie, and in which they would share the costs. And eventually, this was initially perhaps, the attendance was perhaps only allowed by invitation, but eventually it was open, I think in 1787, to all citizens, of course, with the capacity to buy a ticket. So I think the first record of this in Spain is in Madrid in that year, but really closely at the beginning of the 19th century, we have the same in Mexico. So, and in Mexico, it was called Academias de Música, so same word, really.
Fantastic. And you've already mentioned a number of the women who were sort of instrumental in spreading these musical cultures, both in the Iberian Peninsula and in Latin America. Do you think that these women were so important because of a special role that they played? How did women really figure into the shaping of these musical traditions?
Right. So yeah, so definitely one of their roles, and very important roles, as I mentioned before, was the one of being music preservers. Maybe not intentionally, I don't know, but for sure there were copyists. So that already implies some preservation of music and heritage. So, and for example, in the case of Maria Barbara, she was able to preserve Scarlatti sonatas because Scarlatti didn't have any intention of publishing, or at least that we know, an intention of publishing, apart from the esercizi, right? But his sonatas were copied for the use of his student, Maria Barbara. And then, of course, they didn't remain in Spain. They went to Italy. But, you know, it was probably because she wanted to have them like written out so she could study them. She also preserved instruments, although again, this the instrument that she had didn't remain in Spain, and actually I don't think we know where they are. But they are also proof that we find in her estate that the fortepiano arrived really early in Spain because of the Italian connection with Porpora, who and Farinelli, who was you know, very, very a supporter of a fortepiano. So that is one role, yeah, like preservers of instruments, of music, but also they were you know, patrons, because that means that they were funding these other composers to, or at least in the case of Maria Barbara, to compose music for their use. And then the other thing is that they were organizers of musical events. So we know for sure, and there are records, maybe not particularly the ones that I've chosen from the two manuscripts, but there are records that many women, especially from this socioeconomic elite, were organizing these events and funding them, and you know, playing as well in these events, and playing the harpsichord and the fortepiano at this time of the late years of the 18th century. So I think, yeah, there were many, they were playing many important roles. Oh, another example that I've chosen for this program, it's a fortepiano method written in 1802 by María del Carmen Hurtado y Torres. And she composed this when she was only 9. I mean, it's not complicated music, but it's still, you know, valuable. And also it proves that the fortepiano became really popular in Spain at that time, and that people were composing for it especially, and not only, but they were publishing fortepiano methods on how to study it. And the fact that this was published actually at the time by a woman, it's also very impressive, I think.
Very, that's so interesting. Wow. Do we have any idea how this European music was heard and understood by natives of Latin America? Did indigenous peoples start to participate in this kind of music making, or how did it spread among people who were native to those areas?
Right. So, well, this is a very important question and a very good question. Fortunately, I'm not an expert in this topic, and I apologize beforehand for not knowing more. And I really hope this will encourage actually more research. But as I said at the beginning, the formal musical interactions between colonizers and colonized occurred in just one direction, I think. So I think Spaniards taught Native Americans, and maybe more rarely Africans, to sound like Spaniards because, and then they comply because Hispanic institutions provided work. And also because European music in general, it was the sound of high social status. So at some point I came across this very impressive picture, which shows the many different races that, you know, that appear after there was a lot of mix. I think there was a lot of mix between Spaniards and Native Americans. And especially by this time, by the 18th century, they were already very, very mixed. So this picture that I was talking about shows, like, I don't know, like 20 different kinds of races that came out from this mix, with names, each of them. And I think, I mean, this would be beautiful, you know, like hypothetically, but I think they had also like class connotations. So I don't think they were all considered equal. And so I think the fact that European music was, you know, as I said, the sound of high social status means that probably if music with really like heavy influence from natives was composed, maybe it was not so much preserved. Or maybe it was more like the oral tradition, I would say. So, but by this time, what they were composing, like native composers, so people born already in Latin America, sounded really like European, and especially influenced by Italian music, I think. I think this situation also changed in the late years of the 18th century when eventually they were just pursuing the independence. And this is something that we can definitely see in later compositions of the 19th century, where even like classical composers were trying to really introduce traditional elements or previous to European traditional music elements in classical music, I think.
Fascinating, thank you. So, we've talked about a lot of different topics here. Is there anything else that you would like to add, or some key takeaways that you'd like your audience to have with them as they listen to your wonderful program?
Well, I think the most important thing that I wanted to share with this concert and this research project is that these manuscripts not only reveal wonderful music, but also encourage the realization for musicians and historians of the importance of the role that these women play in the preservation of Spanish and Latin American musical heritage. And yeah, that I think that there are still many research gaps around secular music of this period. And I just hope that this will intrigue performers to perform this music and scholars to continue delving into it. And I'm sure there must be more examples of other women whose role has been overlooked and whose legacy would definitely enrich our knowledge of music history.
Wonderful. Well, Patricia, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. And I look forward to sharing our conversation with the audiences of Bloomington Early Music Festival.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much.
Okay.